In this video, we are going to look at the ISLM model. The first thing we need to do here is to explain the fundamental relationship between savings, investment, the fiscal balance, and the trade balance. As we saw in the last section, under the expenditures approach, we can express GDP using this relationship of consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. Also, we know that we can also look at GDP from the income side and develop a relationship based on what we are going to do with our income. We can either spend it, save it, or give it to the government. Now, given that we should get the same GDP number using either method, we can derive a fundamental relationship by equating these two expressions. And after some simple algebra, here is what we end up with. Savings minus business investment equals government spending minus tax income plus net exports. The net government spending term is also known as the fiscal balance, and the net exports term is also known as the trade balance. Now we are going to look at the IS and LM curves and how they combine to form the aggregate demand curve. This is arguably some of the most difficult material on the Level 1 course, so before I go into some details, let me give you a quick outline of what this is all about. The IS curve is the investment savings curve. Any point on the curve tells us a combination of interest rates and real GDP where people are saving as much as they are investing. So if the economy is trundling along at a certain level of real GDP, there will be one interest rate level at which people will save and invest equally. That will be one point on the IS curve. Now, if the economy expands or contracts, creating a new GDP level, we need to move the interest rate to find more points of equilibrium, and that's how we draw the curve. The LM curve is the liquidity preference and money supply curve. Again, this is a curve showing the relationship between interest rates and real GDP, but in this case, any point on the curve represents a place where the quantity of money supplied is equal to the quantity of money demanded. Remember that at a certain level of interest rates, people's demand for money will be based on the opportunity cost of holding money in cash. Remember also that at a certain level of GDP, people will have a certain demand for money because they have transaction needs. The key takeaway here is that aggregate demand, the curve of aggregate demand, which tells us how much output there is in the market at each price level, is made up of points where the IS and LM curves intersect. Given a certain interest rate level and the real GDP of the economy at a certain point in time, the point of intersection between the IS curve and the LM curve will also be on the aggregate demand curve. Now, if the LM curve, for example, were to shift, then the new point of intersection between IS and LM will also be on the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so let's look more closely at the IS curve. As we have said, the IS curve is the investment savings curve. It's a curve which represents equilibrium in the goods market and is drawn from combinations of interest rates and GDP levels where the amount people are saving is equal to the amount people are investing. To draw our IS curve, we are going to start with our expenditure approach to GDP. Output is equal to consumption spending plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. Now, to simplify this derivation, let's assume for now we are in a closed economy, so we have no imports or exports. Next, let's add in what we know about each of these variables and how they are related to GDP and interest rates. We know that a change in the overall level of real GDP will mean a change to national income. So we can say that consumer spending, this C term, will be somehow related to the real GDP level. So we say that C is going to be some function of Y. Also, we know that when rates go down, money will be cheaper and there will be more economically viable projects to undertake. So business investment will be directly related to the level of real interest rates. We are assuming here that government spending will not change in response to either a change in GDP or a change in real interest rates. Now, if we rearrange this formula to get an expression for the level of business investment, we arrive at this expression. investment is equal to real GDP minus personal spending minus government spending. But total income after personal and government spending is just total savings. And this is the foundation for the IS curve. Investment equals savings. Any point on the IS curve is a combination of interest rates and GDP for which this equality holds. So how do we find the points which represent equality between investment and savings? Let's assume this red dot is a point on our IS curve. At this point, where real interest rates are at R1 and GDP is at Y1, we are saving and investing in equal measure and our equality holds. If we hold GDP constant at Y1, then the entire right side of this equation will remain constant. If from there we raise interest rates beyond R1 up to R2, then because investment capital is more expensive, our level of investment will go down. So now, our equality no longer holds. Investment is less than savings. So this point at an interest rate of R2 and output of Y1 cannot be on our IS curve. So now we have an expression which says that when investment is based on an interest rate level of R2, that figure will be less than this right-hand side of the equation which is based on Y1. So now we have an expression which says that when investment is based on an interest rate level of R2, that figure will be less than the right-hand side of the equation which is based on Y1. But if from there we hold interest rates constant at R2, and we are to drop GDP such that the right-hand side of this equation falls, then when we reach Y2, the right-hand side of this equation will match the left, and the equality holds once again. So this must be another point on the IS curve. As you can see then, to stay at equilibrium between savings and investment, we need a downward sloping curve. So to quickly review, I am saying that while interest rates drive investment, investment drives the overall level of GDP, so we can draw a relationship between interest rates and GDP, which results in a downward sloping IS curve. Now, if this isn't working for you, let's think about it from another angle. When we have higher GDP, we have higher incomes. And with higher incomes, we increase both our consumption and our savings. So higher GDP is directly linked to more savings. Now, more savings means banks have more loanable capital, which causes interest rates to fall. Overall, then, we can show how real GDP drives savings, and the amount of savings in turn drives the interest rate. So let's look at that idea in a little more detail. Remember that if something is harder to find, then its price will go up. Now, we know that if real GDP is low, consumption is down, and more importantly, savings is down. And if saving is down, then people aren't depositing money into the banks. Without deposits, banks have less loanable capital, and when loan capital is scarce, the cost of borrowing money is high. And again here, we end up with a graph showing that low interest rates correspond to high GDP and high interest rates correspond to low GDP when we are thinking about investment and savings inequality. Moving on then, let's think about what can cause an IS curve to shift. A shift in the IS curve can come about from a number of different sources. First, we have fiscal policy. With no change to interest rates, the level of investment won't change, but an increase in the budget deficit, which has come about from an increase in government spending, will increase the G term. That will shift the IS curve to the right, where we have a higher level of GDP for each level of interest rates. The general appetite for savings and consumption will also have an impact on the IS curve. When GDP increases, people will have more income to divide between spending and saving. If the general consensus shifts from consumption to saving without any actual change in interest rates, we will see the IS curve shift to the left because people are naturally saving more, regardless of the GDP level or interest rates. Okay, that's the IS curve. Now we're going to move on to the LM curve. The LM curve is all about the money market. LM stands for liquidity and money in a relationship about liquidity preference and the money supply. This curve represents combinations of interest rates and GDP levels where we have equilibrium in the money market, where the money supply is equal to the money demanded. Our understanding of the money supply comes from the quantity theory of money, which is expressed by this equation. Real GDP is equal to the nominal money supply divided by the price level, which is actually just real money supply, multiplied by the velocity of money. Now, the velocity of money is all about how quickly income is converted into consumption. 1 over V then would be considered a measure of people's desire to hold cash balances. From here now we must consider how each of these variables are related to interest rates and GDP. First, we are going to assume that the real money supply is not directly linked to changes in interest rates or GDP. Decisions may be made by the central bank in response to certain situations regarding GDP and interest rates, but we are not going to try and develop a fundamental relationship directly linking cause and effect between the two. So in this case, the M over P term is just going to be a constant. Okay, next, the V term for velocity of money. Now, as we said, this is all about how much people want to hold cash balances or people's desire for spending. So this will be directly related to interest rates. As interest rates rise, people will want to put their money into savings accounts and earn interest. And interest rates fall, people will prefer to hold cash balances. So now we have an expression dependent on interest rates on the right-hand side of the equation and an expression dependent on real GDP on the left. We can take this red dot as a starting point. We assume that this point is on our LM curve. This marks some combination of interest rate R1 and output Y1 at which the amount of money supplied and the amount of money demanded will be equal. Our equation also shows that when the left-hand side of this equation is based on Y1 and the right is based on R1, we have equality. Now, if we are to hold GDP constant at Y1, the right-hand side of our equation stays constant. From there, if we raise interest rates up to R2, we know that this will cause people to desire less cash balances. They will want to increase their marginal propensity to consume. So the V term is going to rise. In this scenario, the left-hand side has gone up while the right has stayed constant. So our equation doesn't hold. And that means that at this point, R2 and Y1, that point cannot be on the LM curve. So now we have an expression which tells us that when the left-hand side of our equation is based on R2, it will be greater than an output level of Y1. So we are out of balance. Let's say now that we hold interest rates constant at R2. That means that the marginal propensity to consume will stay constant at a level corresponding to that interest rate level. And if we go ahead and increase GDP up to Y2, then the right-hand side of our equation will once again match the left, bringing our equation into equality and marking for us a new point on the LM curve. From there, we can see clearly that to maintain equality in our expression and to hold equilibrium between the money supplied and the money demanded, we will have an upward sloping LM curve. Okay, so what will cause a shift in the LM curve? The first factor which you need to be aware of that will shift the LM curve is monetary policy. When the central bank increases the money supply, ignoring any expectation of inflation, the value of money at any given level of interest rates is going to go down. Because there is more money floating around, each unit of currency is going to be worth less. So the LM curve will shift to the right, to shift that now at each level of GDP, the corresponding level of interest rates for equilibrium is going to be less. The second thing which will shift the LM curve is the price level. So remember that the real money supply is equal to the nominal money supply divided by the price level. So when the price level rises, the LM curve will shift to the left to mark a new point where interest rates and GDP lead to equilibrium in the money market. When the IS and LM curves are plotted together, the point where they intersect represents general equilibrium in both the goods market and the money market, which means equilibrium between the price level and real GDP for a certain given level of real money supply. Remember this idea from the beginning of the video. The aggregate demand curve is made up of the intersection points between the IS and LM curves. Each intersection between IS and LM marks a real GDP level and a price level which exists on the aggregate demand curve. By altering the price level, we move the LM curve, creating a new intersection between IS and LM and a new point on the aggregate demand curve. At each price level, we have a different equilibrium point at the intersection of the IS and LM curves, and plotting those equilibrium points on a graph of price level versus GDP, we can draw the aggregate demand curve.